Thanks very much for coming, Mr. Ryvchin. Would you please give us your title or job description and also take either an oath or an affirmation?
Sure. It's Alex Ryvchin. I'm the Co-Chief Executive Officer of the Executive Council of Australian Jury. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you. I'd like to make a short opening statement.
Thank you. I'm deeply grateful to Mr. Borzak and the members of this committee for your work, which goes to the heart of freedom and fairness in the state that we are blessed to call home. I appreciate the opportunity to meet before you. I'd like to speak about the impact that anti-Semitic incidents have on individuals and families by sharing how my family was affected by the attack on our former home in Dover Heights in the early hours of Friday the 17th of January of this year. I became aware of the incident at around 5 a.m. that morning. My family and I had returned the previous evening from a holiday in Brisbane, and the day after the incident I was due to fly overseas. The Friday on which the attack occurred was supposed to be the solitary day of rest at home with my family, ushering in the Sabbath before taking off again. My wife shook me from my sleep and handed me her phone. It was footage taken by our old neighbours across the street, flames rising high into the night sky, scorched cars with the words F the Jews and F Israel daubed on them, and the facade of our former family home disfigured with red paint. I switched on my phone and it began ringing immediately. One after another, journalists offering condolences with one breath, looking for the scoop that it was indeed my former home with the next. We thought of our 3 daughters who would soon be awake and jumping into our bed as they do every morning. My wife arranged for her mother to collect them to allow us to deal with the chaos. By early afternoon, the story broke that the house had for 5 years been our family home. My wife and I then walked to the house to inspect the damage, to comfort our friends and neighbours, and to answer the questions of the media assembled there. That evening, I asked my wife if I should cancel my trip. How could I leave them? How could I not go, she said to me. As much as she wanted me home, what could be more fateful and appropriate than representing the community at the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, to honour and remember, to contemplate man's capacity to burn and destroy, to hear the final testimonies of the survivors. And so at 6 a.m. the following morning, I was on the plane, leaving my wife to answer the questions of our daughters, to explain to them why someone had replaced the whitewash I had lovingly applied with red paint signifying blood, why they had scrawled words cursing the Jewish people on the cars out front, targeted the place where we had built our family and experienced the happiest days of our lives, a suburban street where families slept just meters from the inferno. And the toughest question of all, which came repeatedly from our middle daughter, aged 9, are we safe now? Are they going to come for us again? A question we still don't fully know how to answer without deceiving ourselves and them. A few weeks later, as I was boarding the long flight home, I checked in with my wife and my colleagues. At that moment, news about the Jewel caravan was breaking. I received the update that a list of Jewish targets was found in the caravan. There were rumours that an attack was imminent. Fear was sweeping through the community. My wife asked me another question I didn't know how to answer. Was it safe, or should she wake the kids and leave the house? This is, of course, how terror is intended to work, to alter our perceptions and decision-making through fear, shatter the sense of predictability and order which allows us to live our lives. For the Jewish community, we have been targeted day after day, and it has forced families to ask whether their children are safe sitting in a classroom in a Jewish school, or were they sitting ducks? Would their loved ones receive proper care in our hospitals, or would they encounter more people who thought and felt like the Bankstown nurses? Could they enter our CBD with a Star of David necklace or a Jewish head covering? Was that humble act of faith, or just asking for trouble? In reflecting on the attack on my former home, I don't wish to mislead this committee. I'm here giving something of a victim impact statement, but I in no way consider myself a victim. The attack may have made national and international headlines, but it is not nearly the most serious or life-altering incident. Every day for 20 months, I've spoken to members of my community who have been abused, threatened, who face the risk of being pushed out of their industry, of losing their livelihood, of being denied the ability to do what they love because they are Jewish and hold ordinary mainstream views. Each such incident changes a person. It changes their sense of worth, their state of mind, and how they engage with those around them. This in turn changes how communities interact and how society functions. The summer of fire bombings may have passed, but the daily experiences of Jews in New South Wales and around the world has not changed. Indeed, in the short weeks between the hearings of this committee, we entered a dangerous new phase. A young couple engaged to be married was murdered, shot to death from point-blank range outside a Jewish community event in Washington, D.C., hosted by an organization that is a close partner of my organization. 8 people were burned during a peaceful walk in Boulder, Colorado, to raise awareness about the plight of Israeli hostages. An 88-year-old woman, a Holocaust survivor, remains in a critical condition. In both cases, the terrorists yelled "Free Palestine" as they attempted to kill innocent people in a Western country. A few days ago, a long-time organizer and leader of the Free Palestine movement in this country, an academic at Sydney University, said he wanted to see Zionists executed. The inability to distinguish between political activists and those who just want to execute Zionists has allowed anti-Semitism to shift from the margins to mainstream, even educated and fashionable society. And it has signaled to other violent elements, including neo-Nazis and organized crime, that publicly attacking Jews is a legitimate and effective form of action. Those who deny anti-Semitism, or say it is provoked by things Jewish people say or do, or think it is invented as a ploy to shield Israel from criticism, not only re-injure those who have suffered, they threaten the stability of our society. Excusing attacks on one minority serves to normalize abnormal conduct that threatens society as a whole. If we don't solve this problem, anti-Semitism will degrade this country and strip away the virtues of fairness, rationalism and decency that make it the greatest country in the world. And so I wish you great success in your important work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Questions?
Thank you so much for appearing today and for your opening statement. The 2 individuals that were involved in the incident on your former home, they've now been charged, and my understanding is that they were on remand from previous attacks, whether it would be graffiti or fire-related incidents, I think with Newtown Synagogue. Is that correct?
Look, my understanding is based very much on what's in the public domain. I mean, I had conversations with counterterrorism in the hours after the attack in connection with my own personal safety and the safety of my family. But since that time, I've had fleeting conversations with the AFP and state police. So it's really a matter of what's been reported. I understand that 2 individuals, as you say, have been arrested or were already held. And the police are investigating the probability that it was a larger conspiracy involving drug smugglers and low-level criminals and so forth. But there seems to be a strong organised crime component to it, is what I understand.
And I think this is important because I've heard some commentary recently about, oh, this is all from criminals, it's not anti-Semitic. But when you see red paint that says things like F the Jews on a home that they assumed was owned by you, I mean, how can it be anything other than an anti-Semitic attack? I mean, how do you, all of the media commentary that's come out over the last few months in particular, how do you differentiate that between incidents that are involved with, criminal-inspired incidents versus anti-Semitic incidents? I suppose the line being, or the connection being, that these criminal acts are only taking place on Jewish targets, or assumed to be Jewish targets, so they themselves are anti-Semitic attacks in nature, aren't they? I mean, how can you differentiate it?
Look, I agree with that analysis. I think that there have been segments of society and the media and the political class that have sought to deny or minimize anti-Semitism. I think they had that agenda from the beginning. And when the police announced that the Jewel incident appeared to be a hoax, in the sense that it wasn't intended to be a live attack to be carried through, I think a lot of people rejoiced that the entire summer of terror that jeopardized the lives of the Jewish community, that targeted very specific Jewish homes and institutions and places of worship with very clear slogans referring to the Jewish community, which were clearly materially anti-Semitic, without question. But I think it served the agenda of some to deny that, or to obfuscate, or to confuse or divert the discussion. But when you have attacks of that sort, firebombings of Jewish-owned businesses, a place of worship, of the former home of a community leader, it's very clearly anti-Semitic. And I think the more that was revealed about this organised crime syndicate and the alleged kingpin and his own personal background and his views and ideology, I think that reinforced the view that it was very clearly anti-Semitic. But I think the critical thing is the outcome rather than even the ideology or the motivation. Yeah. And one thing I was asked a lot in the aftermath of the police press conference was, do you feel a relief that this was organised crime rather than more, say, conventional anti-Semitic actors? And I can tell you that relief was the furthest thing from my mind and the minds of the community. When you suddenly have, in addition to more conventional anti-Semitic actors, people with ready access to guns and explosives who were clearly willing to set things on fire. That's right. It's another dose of danger and terror that was struck into the community.
So in some ways it was, some of these incidents were not anti-Semitic by intention, but they were anti-Semitic by effect or by implication. The end result of what's happening is that Jewish businesses, homes, cars are being targeted, even if the intention was criminal and maybe not anti-Semitic inspired. The effect of what is being undertaken is it's only Jewish targets. So the implication or the community that's bearing the effects of that is the Jewish community. So I think there's almost a I think that it's, would you agree, it's almost unhelpful to downplay the anti-Semitic nature of some of these incidents, whether it be graffiti or fire bombings or various other incidents that we've seen throughout all of the summer in particular. I mean, it's getting a little bit better now, but I think the summer was the worst of what we saw. Yeah,
well, look, I think it's absolutely impossible to downplay the anti-Semitic element to all this. When again, when you have synagogues burned, attempted attacks on other places of worship, Jewish businesses, homes, we all know the list of targets, all unequivocally Jewish targets. I think it would be insane to try to remove an anti-Semitic component from it. The effect was very clearly anti-Semitic, and the effect was very clearly to terrorize the Jewish community without question. As to the motives and intent, we can't fully know that until obviously, the matter is brought before the courts. But again, I feel like there are segments of society that are bending over backwards to try to find motives which may not be there, purely because it advances their agenda. It allows them to minimize or distract the eye from what's happening in our society. But the other point that I'd note is that while the fire bombings were the most high profile and the most terrifying incidents, we've had, my organisation has logged merely in the year after October 7 over 2,000 incidents of anti-Semitism. And as I mentioned there, every one of these incidents affected someone's state of mind, their quality of life, their ability to do what they love. It made them feel estranged and separated from wider society. It has an impact on our social harmony and how communities function and interact with one another. So while what we call the summer of terror has thankfully subsided and hopefully we've seen the end of it, but again, I caution, given what's happening abroad and given the incidents in the United States to which I referred, I think the end is not upon us yet. I think the worst might still be to come. But every day, Jewish Australians in this state are suffering incidents, whether it be in schoolyards and university campuses, in workplaces, whether we see global campaigns on TikTok calling for the destruction, the obliteration of Israel and its people. This continues on a daily basis.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yep.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks so much for coming along to give evidence. It's appreciated. I remember around the time that the existence of that criminal conspiracy was revealed, the Daily Telegraph had a front page that said it was all a vile hoax. That, to me, rather seems to understate the matter. And I was just wondering if you could talk to, and you already have to an extent, but can you talk to what significance you attached in terms of what had happened to you to this revelation of the criminal conspiracy, and in what ways, I suppose, it didn't change what had happened to you?
Look, when something like that happens, and I described in detail how it unfolded and how we experienced as a family, all of these analyses afterwards and revelations about a criminal syndicate or whatever the motives were, it doesn't really alter anything, because what happened happened, and the incidents that have struck the Jewish community, whether my family or others, they occurred. Multiple media, it wasn't merely the Telegraph, multiple media ran with that lead bulletin of it was all a hoax. And again, I think some of it was self-serving and others were perhaps misinterpreting exactly what the police were saying. But again, the effect of that was to quell the conversation about anti-Semitism, because prior to that point, there was a necessary public examination of what was happening in our society, the impact it was having on Jewish Australians and wider social cohesion. It was a conversation that had to be had. And I feel like with this, inaccurate and careless reporting about it all being a hoax, it kind of killed that conversation. And the other thing that it did was, social media was for a long time awash with conspiracy theories that all of this was concocted by the Jewish community. There was an inside job, a Mossad plot, all of these nonsense theories that tend to attach themselves to the Jewish people. So you can imagine the storm that kicked off on social media and in other recesses of society. They felt vindicated. They felt like indeed none of this had actually happened, or it had been inflicted on the Jewish community by itself. So it was careless, and I think it was unproductive, but it's important that we reset and recalibrate the conversation to talk about what actually transpired and how we as a society can move to actually curing this problem.
Yeah. Having worked in the criminal law for 2 decades, I'm pretty sceptical about the proposition that a person who would create this criminal conspiracy to achieve this ulterior motive and would so focus it on the Jewish community wouldn't also be anti-Semitic, even if they had an ulterior motive. It seems to me that the revelation of the conspiracy, though, is relevant to, I suppose, what that spree of terrible attacks said about community-wide sentiment, because I do remember throughout that time that there was a lot of understandable things said, that this spree of attacks, I suppose, reflected some community-level rise in anti-Semitism in and of itself. And it seems to me that the true relevance of that plot is not that the whole thing was not anti-Semitic, but rather that it seems to have been the actions of one person. He, of course, used agents, but there's no suggestion that they were anti-Semitic, and it's my understanding. They seem to have been people not with an ideological motive and people in the criminal milieu. And I'm just wondering if you would agree with that analysis.
Look, I do. And again, it's based on conjecture and theories, because until we have these people in custody and before the courts and we see the evidence, it's difficult to draw any kind of definite conclusions. But for a criminal mastermind to concoct a scheme of this complexity involving so many moving parts and individuals, and to identify individual Jewish targets, source addresses potentially of Jewish communal leaders, to do all of these things.
From Turkey.
That's right. and to have no ill feeling towards the Jewish community, I don't buy it. I think it's highly implausible. And then, of course, you mentioned the Telegraph. The Telegraph broke a story that identified this individual and looked through his social media history, and he's got a long record of posting viciously anti-Semitic statements, glorifying Nazism, calling for the death of Jews, and so forth. So I think the case became more complex at that point in time. No one was surprised by those revelations. But again, I think we're in the realm of theory and conjecture here, but I think what happened is what's critical here. And what the Jewish community experienced is no hoax. The flames, the abuse, the harassment, the exclusion, it's very, very real.
Yeah. An issue before the inquiry, which I'm sure you're aware of, is the conflation of criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. And it seems to be one of those issues where, to work out what anti-Semitism is and the extent of it, we perhaps need to also work out what it is not. And you've been, I think it's fair to say, a vigorous advocate in the public sphere for the state of affairs as you see it, and you're probably someone on a particular end of the spectrum in terms of how you analyse certain criticisms of Israel and what you see as anti-Semitic that other people might see as legitimate criticism.
I'm not sure if you could elaborate on what you mean by
Yeah,
the
I mean, I
spectrum
don't mean to put words in your mouth, and
No,
I think,
sure.
I think the question I finish with is going to give you the chance to explain this.
great.
And I'm just wondering if you could tell us, what do you see as the line between legitimate criticism of Israel, particularly from a Palestinian Arab perspective, and anti-Semitism?
To me, it's very clear, and I don't think there's a genuine conflation. I think that people can very clearly distinguish between critiques of policy and politicians, which is utterly fair game in this country, and about Israel, within Israel and outside as well, and a deep contempt and hatred for the Jewish people. I think there's a very clear distinction between them. If we talk about, for example, Itamar Ben-Gvir or Bezalel Smotrich, a couple of firebrand, far-right politicians in that country, you can criticize them freely. I have. We criticize them when they're brought into the opposition. No element of that would be considered anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist. It is a criticism of individuals and their rhetoric and their policies. But something happens when we talk about Israel that is peculiar to Israel, and that seems to happen with no other country. We can talk about Iran, China, Russia, whatever democracy or autocracy in the world. The conversation never then becomes about denying the right of that people to be a people, the right of that people to have a state. We never transfer classic anti-Semitic or racist views about a particular people to the country and impute motives to those people and say, you do what you do because this is how Jews behave and have always behaved. So to me, we can talk about settlements, we can talk about the war, how it's being conducted, ceasefires. None of that is illegitimate. And I know some people will use more trenchant, aggressive forms of criticism, which doesn't, again, of itself constitute anti-Semitism. It could be wrong, it could be ignorant, it could be hateful, but not necessarily anti-Semitic. So to me, it's very clear. And I think the greater conflation occurs not with anti-Semitism and, say, anti-Zionism, but between anti-Zionism and criticism of Israel. You know, you can criticize Israel and its policy and actions and politicians and not talk about the right of the state to exist, which again occurs with no other country.
It seems to me, though, that there's a number of aspects to the issue that are almost unique. For example, I'll just give you an example. It's often said that it would be anti-Semitic to deny the right of Israel to exist. There's obviously this contested issue of the right to return, for example, and it's often said that if the right to return was granted, it would be the end of Israel. So sometimes for some people to say Israel has the right to exist necessarily for them involves the denial of the right to return, because the right to return on that analysis is inconsistent with the existence of Israel going forward. How do we unpick, for example, a view of a Palestinian perhaps expelled in 1948 or 1967 who thinks Israel is a thoroughly racist endeavour and would like a right of return, and therefore might be taken to be questioning the right of the Jewish state to exist? How do we analyse their statements and their opinions in light of this line between anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel that sometimes, as a threshold issue, is said to involve acceptance of the right to exist?
I mean, look, you've chosen a very specific example to do with the right of return.
Yep.
And I'm not suggesting that any Arab Palestinian who bears a grievance from 1948 and the population transfers of Jews and Arabs that occurred as a result of that needless war waged by 7 Arab states on a nascent Jewish state. Things happen in war, population shift, people suffer without question, and I wouldn't deny anyone suffering. But I suppose the question you're asking is if a Palestinian says, my great-grandfather lived in Haifa or Akko prior to 1948, they were displaced, and people were displaced for all sorts of reasons, including fleeing a war zone, including because they were caught up in the battle lines.
And including ethnic cleansing.
I would deny that there was no program for ethnic cleansing. There was no policy of ethnic cleansing.
Well, but you wouldn't dispute that it occurred, I presume.
No, I firmly would dispute that it occurred. I mean, when we talk about ethnic cleansing, you talk about the forcible expulsion of a particular ethnicity or race of people from a territory. Now, that did not occur as a program. If that did occur, then you wouldn't have had 20% of Israel's population being Arab. You wouldn't have had the mayor of Haifa going on broadcast to the people saying, do not leave, this is your city as well.
So you say not as a program, But you don't deny that in particular instances that it occurred.
I resent and I reject the use of the term ethnic cleansing. I will say that certainly people who lived in certain places prior to 1948 ceased to live there, and as I said, that occurred for a number of reasons, including the natural human compulsion to flee a war zone, including the leaders of the Arabs saying, depart this war zone and then return once we've driven the Jews into the sea. There were a myriad of reasons, and one of those reasons was that there were Arab towns and villages caught up in the war and the fighting, because Israel was invaded from many fronts but also from within, and certain villages were removed of their populations because they were caught up in the battle zone and they were behind the lines of the Israeli fighters, so it was necessary from a military point of view. Horrible things happen in war. You know, people are displaced, and I think the lesson from that is don't start wars, and don't start wars that you lose. We also saw about 800,000 Jews living throughout the world forcibly removed, plundered, and expelled from their countries. To me, that far greater constitutes ethnic cleansing than a defensive, legitimate war and what happened as a consequence of that war.
Sure.
Mr. Lawrence.
Oh, finished, am I?
Oh, yeah,
About 10 minutes ago.
10 minutes ago.
Oh, sorry. I've got a lot more questions.
We can
but
pick it
I'll
up
yield.
after.
If I could ask one question, just
Sure.
following up on
That's
this
a good-
line
a
of
good line of
questioning, and I've
questioning.
been reading the ECAJ report on anti-Semitism for 2024,
Yeah.
which you've quoted. First of all, to say that some of the examples in this are really chilling for anyone who's going to accuse me of trying to minimise anti-Semitism. But one of the examples in that report, in the section on graffiti, was an example of graffiti that simply said "Free Gaza," and that was given as an example of anti-Semitism
Yeah.
in your report. Can you explain in what way you or your organisation view that statement as anti-Semitic?
Sure. I mean, I don't have that specific incident in front of me. I don't know to what exactly it refers. But if you're asking me the question whether graffiti saying "Free Gaza" of itself is anti-Semitic, I would say no. But context is critical, and every single incident that's in that report there because of context. So, for example, if one were to daub that on a synagogue or proximate to a Jewish site in a way that implies that Jews are collectively responsible for the situation in Gaza, that would be anti-Semitic. But if someone walks down the street at a rally and waves a banner saying "Free Gaza," I wouldn't consider that anti-Semitic, and the report certainly wouldn't either.
Okay. So I think a part of the challenge that I'm facing, and certainly the committee is facing in trying to establish the problem that we're trying to address, the report says that based on the definition of anti-Semitism you've used, or the way that these incidents have been compiled, that there was an increase of 316% in anti-Semitic incidents following 30th September 2023. It's a deeply concerning statistic.
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to understand is how many of those incidents are, in the order of the really distressing, clearly anti-Semitic physical assault examples that are described in this report, versus political messages that may be, contested even within the Jewish community, whether that's anti-Semitic or not. Is it possible to provide a further breakdown of that data to help us understand the nature of the anti-Semitic incidents that you're counting?
So the report does break things down in terms of general discourse, incidents, whether it's physical assault, whether it's graffiti, whether it's vandalism. So it's broken down by category of incident. And some of them naturally are more extreme than others. So an attack on an individual is going to be more distressing than graffiti, certainly. But they're all incidents. They're all incidents of anti-Semitism. Now, political slogans in and of themselves are not counted in this report as being anti-Semitic incidents. Again, if the context in which it occurred leads one to conclude that it was an act of anti-Semitism because of the way that it targeted Jewish individuals. If a Jewish student, and again I'm just raising examples here, but this occurs frequently, if a Jewish student, visibly Jewish, is walking through a university campus and someone starts taunting them with "Free Gaza, Free Palestine," merely because they are visibly Jewish, that is the harassment of a Jewish person because they are Jewish. That's all that is.
Yeah, no, I
So
understood.
the slogan
and what
of
I'm trying
itself-
to unpick, so you have provided the breakdown in the report, and I've got it in front of me. So you've got 33% of the incidents being posters, 19% graffiti, 14% messages. And I'm focusing on those ones because they are much more difficult to understand than the 3% assault, which are which are well described in the report. It's a significant proportion of the incidents that you're reporting that are in this category of sort of a poster. surely it's difficult to work out whether a poster is targeted at somebody, a
Sure.
political poster is being targeted at someone because of their ethnic background.
Sure,
Surely
sure.
a poster is not targeted at a person by definition.
No, look, that's right. And if that's the case, it doesn't make into the report. We have a very stringent threshold as to what goes in there. So if a poster about, let's say even genocide, which is a very extreme, ignorant accusation, but people make it, and I wouldn't consider that to be of itself anti-Semitic. So if that is plastered somewhere on a public street, I think it's pretty disgraceful and inflammatory and devoid of truth, but I don't consider it to be anti-Semitic. But again, if it's done proximate deliberately to a Jewish site or at a Jewish facility, then that's a different situation. So, but again, as with Mr. Lawrence's example with the right of return, I think we're identifying very specific examples and perhaps outlying examples. And when you talk about messages and slogans, the vast majority of them are unequivocally, viciously anti-Semitic and very clearly targeting the Jewish community, including wishing death upon members of the Jewish community. Sometimes they use euphemisms like Zionist, frequently they don't. So there are those examples that we would consider to be on the lower spectrum of things, and some might be a little bit debatable, and we can have that conversation. But we're talking about over 2,000 incidents. We're talking about an experience the Jewish community has lived through for a long period of time. We know what hatred against us looks like. And the things that go on that report are anti-Semitic incidents, they're not political discourse.
I might just ask a question if I can, Mr. Ryvchin.
Sure.
Has yours or your family's relationship and belief in Australia changed at all?
Oh, that's a very fine question. Look, I consider this, as I said in my remarks, to be the greatest and freest country in the world. I came to this country as a refugee from the Soviet Union, having seen the alternative, despotism, socialism and communism and autocracy, the denial of human dignity and human rights, and so I cherish these things in this country. And of course, in the past 20 months, I've seen things which have shocked me, which have saddened me deeply. The house that I spoke about was, I don't want to digress too much, but when we first migrated to the country, I would drive up and down that street with my grandfather, who drove a van taking Holocaust survivors to a Jewish community center. And he was so taken with that road because it looked out onto the ocean. And to him, that road symbolized the greatest of Australia, the freedom and beauty of this country. And then to have a house on that road, which I had purchased, defiled in that way, it hurt me on a very deep and personal level. But it has made me more determined to fight for this country, fight for the goodness of this country, and to banish the hateful elements from it, because it's not Australia. I mean, I've encountered racism and anti-Semitism throughout my life in limited instances, but this is not a racist country, this is not an anti-Semitic country. And I think we have a duty to drive those horrific elements from our sight. Otherwise, this country will change in its character. But I remain a great lover and great patriot of this country.
You talk about coming from what is now Ukraine, and my ancestors actually were expelled from eastern Poland by the Soviet Union, just as the World War II was beginning. So, and I have relatives that now live in what is the current Poland on the east, and they certainly talk about what was going on in those days. So I have a little bit of sympathy, or a lot of sympathy actually, for what you're talking about. Do you actually believe that we could go back to the old ways before all this got started? Can we ever get to that level again, that perfection you're talking about?
Look, I'm an eternal optimist, which might sound paradoxical with being a Jewish person and the things that we've experienced, but I do think the best of human nature and certainly of this society. But I do know that what has been allowed to move into the public sphere, into mainstream discourse and conversation, will be very hard to push back. There was always elements of this society that was anti-Semitic, and people held certain stereotypes and beliefs and prejudices, but we didn't have what one would call active anti-Semitism. People maybe latently harbored certain views about Jews, but they weren't compelled, they didn't feel the right or the freedom to act upon that. And that's the real thing that's changed. People feel they can voice this anti-Semitism. And then what's happening with social media, the disinformation, the recruitment, the radicalization, it's the sort of tool that Henry Ford or Martin Luther and certainly the Soviets and the Nazis could have only dreamed of having to advance their agenda. So it's going to be extremely challenging, and it will require a wider approach than merely government and merely community. but I do believe fundamentally in the goodness of this country, and I think we need to arrest the problem before our character is forever changed.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you so much.